everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. I'm super excited to be sharing this facet of Virginia Woolf's life and also British modernism. As Chris said, I am in the final stages of my DPhil here, and this is pretty much what my research is all about. But more specifically, my research is looking at Virginia Woolf as not just an author, but as a bookmaker. A lot of people are maybe unaware that she made books. She made books in her private life, but also for the Hogarth Press. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Just a quick overview of the Hogarth Press if you are unfamiliar with what that is. Virginia Woolf and her husband Leonard in 1917 started a printing press. It was started as essentially a hobby, something for fun, something that they could do together, but it turned into something much more than that. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the way that these books are laid out is essentially trying to capture the evolution of the Hogarth Press. What's amazing about the archives here is that there is almost a book from every period of the press's evolution, but we're going to be starting at the very beginnings, the early 1919 era, their hand press era, and then continue into their commercial era, and even into the late era of the press with some of these dust jackets here. So to start off at the very beginning, we have Kew Gardens. I'm assuming a lot of you are familiar with the story of Kew Gardens, so I won't get into it, but maybe this is the first time that you're seeing the first edition of Kew Gardens. Well, this is actually the second edition, but it looks identical to the first edition. So the way that this production worked is that they were still in their small press period, where they were hand printing everything from their home on a small tabletop press. And they made this book. This is by Virginia Woolf, and it's decorated with woodcuts by her sister Vanessa Bell. And they made it 150 copies, sold it to their friends, their families through a subscribers list. But then, interestingly enough, a reviewer picked up this copy and wrote about it in the Times Literary Supplement, and that was the beginning of the evolution of the press. I'm not here to theorize as to whether the Hogarth Press would have become a big commercial success had this not happened, but I think a lot of it has to do with this review. So this happened in May 1919. By a week or two later, they had over 500 orders come in for this book that they only made 150 copies for. So they, in a rush, in a panic, they employed an external printer, and suddenly they were moving towards a period of commercialization. So the external printer that they hired for this text was named Richard Madeley. He was a professional printer. He had done work with other members of the Bloomsbury group, such as Roger Fry. And they knew of him, but they didn't know him well enough. But like I said, they were in a rush, so they just hired him. What's really interesting about the second edition is that it is, for the most part, considered to be an externally produced book. However, this copy, and maybe other copies as well, but this copy in particular, is very clearly not done entirely by a professional printer, by Richard Madeley. And what's really interesting about this is that in the first page, you can see that there is a differentiation of paper sizes. And this is important because if an external printer was printing, binding, and returning this book for the Wolves to then publish, all the paper sizes should be the same. However, in this copy, there is a differentiation between the first page, which is where the woodcut is sitting, and also the very last page, again, where this woodcut is printed. So you might think, what does this have to do with anything at all? Well, if you are into book history and bibliography, which is what I'm very into, you would also notice that this final page has a lot of hyphenations, which is also very weird if a professional printer had typeset and then printed this. So it shows that possibly this was done in a collaborative effort between the Wolves and Richard Madeley. And then, of course, this leads to the idea, why on earth would the Wolves do the woodcuts and the final pages, what's going on here? Well, there is a little bit of insight into the production of this text from Virginia Woolf's letters. She actually writes to Vanessa Bell that in relation to Richard Madeley, he's gone and cut all the covers crooked. Some are too large and some are too small. And to add to my melancholy troubles, I've had to pare down the book's edges with a penknife to fit them. So he has clearly messed up in some regard of these books, and as a result, there has been this collaborated effort, possibly, of the book production of the second edition. So what does this mean? Why do we care about this? It's essentially showing that this transition from small private hand press to commercialization is not smooth, it's not linear, and it is usually collaborative, improvised, and occasionally corrective. So we'll move past this now and look very briefly at the next batch of books. So after this point, they had started thinking about commercializing the press. So here we have 3 more books. Out of these 3, one of them is made entirely by a professional printer, and they did not do any part of the production. Are any of you able to tell which of these 3 books was done by a professional printing company? No. This one. So what are we looking at here? This is when they started to create essentially a house style. And it is through this period, from Kew Gardens to then poems to then 12 original woodcuts. These are all handmade, done by Virginia and Leonard Woolf at the press. And then this is 1920, their first entirely outsourced book. They retained the same visual look. It's hard to tell without opening up the book to see whether it was done by Leonard and Virginia Woolf or by someone else. And the reason why this is interesting is they are essentially trying to brand themselves as something different than what was on the market at the time. However, they continued to hand print and bind occasionally, but as the years continued, they ended up more and more sending their books out to be printed and then just retaining the publishing credit for them. Then, as we're continuing on, I've included this because I think it's hilarious, but this is in 1923, they published The Wasteland. They have printed and they have also bound this book themselves. And we know that they printed it and did it themselves because here on page 7, there is at the very bottom here a typo. Virginia Woolf was the primary typesetter at the press and Leonard was the printer. So they both collaboratively made this error and it somehow got through and published, but where it says that they flowed instead of over the London Bridge, which is what it should say, it says under the London Bridge. So you can come and look at that and see for yourself if you think that changes the entire meaning of the poem. I think it does. But yeah, he wasn't entirely happy with them in that output, and that I think was the last book that T.S. Eliot published with the Hogarth Press. So they're still amateurs and they're still learning as they go. But they eventually get the hang of it, and moving on to now the late 1920s, we see that they are entirely outsourcing their printing, but they're still retaining design final decisions. So they are in charge of making sure what papers are used. And as you can see, the style remains the same. It's still that really bright patterned paper with a cut out and pasted title. And then at the very end here, we see 1927, and this isn't the end of the Hogarth Press, but this is the end of perhaps their small press status. We see Kew Gardens again, 8 years later, and it is now a deluxe limited edition. It is published in a large format, and it is being sold in an exclusive commodity luxury market, very different from the first edition and second edition that we saw 8 years earlier. So that is just a very brief overview of one part of the Hogarth Press's evolution. As the years continue, like I said earlier, Vanessa Bell was very involved also in the designs. of the books for the Hogarth Press, and in particular Virginia Woolf's books. So we have 2 dust jackets here. These are from much, much later. This is The Years and 3 Guineas. And Vanessa Bell became the sole designer of all of Virginia Woolf's book jackets, her dust jackets. And she retained that right even once Woolf passed away. She still maintained being her lead book designer, essentially. So yeah, that was really fast. I hope that was under time or right on time. But if anyone has any questions about anything, please come and talk to me about it, because I love talking about this stuff.